myself. You need to put it on silence. Good evening, everyone. I think it is 7 o'clock your time, 8 o'clock our time. Are we ready to start? I'm just a novice to this program, so you need to give me some time to familiarize myself with it. Can you all hear me? If you guys could use the chat box and tell me whether you can hear me, so we could start with the presentation. Okay, I guess everyone could see and hear, so let's crack on with the presentation. Good evening, everyone. My name is Ali Qasqas. I am your presenter for the day. We're going to go through the diversity and inclusion and the inclusive environment CPD session. Before I start with the presentation, I would like to thank Middle East Quantity Surveying Association for arranging those CPD sessions and for inviting me to take part of it. I really appreciate that. It's great efforts that those guys are putting to contribute to our profession. So thank you guys for that, and thank you for the opportunity that you've given us. Before I start introducing myself, could you please, in the chat box again, let me know what part of the quantity surveying or built environment world you come from, so I can get an idea. Okay. Quantity surveying from Dubai. Oman. Good. Qatar, Sri Lanka. Good. So we are a diverse community so far. Saudi Arabia. Welcome all. Shall we start with the topics for the day? But before then, let me introduce myself. My name is Ali Qasqas. I'm a chartered quantity surveyor by profession. I've been around the construction industry for, and the built environment industry, I should say, for 15 years or so. I have worked in the UK and in the Middle East, mainly in Oman. The projects that I've been involved in so far range from a small repair job to a mega project. So at the moment, I am looking after a mega project for a client, a major client in Oman called PDO, Petroleum Development of Oman. As I said, you know, I have started with small projects and I moved on, so I do have experience in small projects and big projects as well. I am also an APC assessor, and I am a qualified expert witness by the RICS. I think enough said about myself. Let's move on to what are we going to cover during our CPD session. But before I do that, I just wanted to mention that most of this CPD session is going to be catered towards the quantity surveyors mainly, or any pathway that are going through their CPD, their APC at the moment. So for those who are either going through the APC or halfway through it towards the end, they'll find lots of information, hopefully useful information for them. And for those who haven't started yet or not thinking, please bear with me, because the information that I'll give is mainly catered towards the APC candidates, but also we're going to cover the topics that we mentioned at the beginning of those slides in enough depth for you to get enough knowledge towards the topics that are going to be covered today. I think we have covered the introduction part, and the next part of my presentation will be a moment of reflection, I called it, which is basically more about tips about the RICS process and what's the best way to approach it. How I sort of put this presentation together is for candidates to be in the driving seat, and I will demonstrate this in the slides. So you see how you need to look at the APC pathways and pathway guides and be in the driving seat and see what you need to present and what you need to demonstrate as a competence. We will then move into our two topics for the night, which are diversity, inclusion, and team working. That is the first topic. Then the second topic follow that. It's the inclusive environments, which are both APC requirements. After that will be probably for the guys on the APC, the most anticipated part of the presentation. It's the possible interview questions. And we'll end up with a Q&A session. So if you have any questions, let's leave it to the end, and we will have time at the end of the presentation for a Q&A session. So let's start with the strategic approach or general tips about the APC. I do have here in front of me few points that I would like to talk about and share with you guys, and hopefully you'll find helpful wherever you are in your APC journey. What I wanted to say that the APC structure itself is a holistic approach. We know that you guys, especially the guys in the Middle East, come with bags and bags of experience. But on top of that, what the RICS requires, an all-rounded surveyor that doesn't only know what's happening or how to do things in his specialized area, but also has a wider vision to see what's happening around in the bigger built environment world. So please look at the APC process as a holistic approach, and when you embark on your journey of the APC, please start with reading the pathway guide. Read the pathway guide from the first page, sorry, excuse me, from the first page to the last page before you dive into the competencies, mainly the technical competencies. So read it, understand it, try and find out what is exactly required of you. The other point that I wanted to mention, that you can work smart rather than work hard. Because if you look at the pathway guide, you will realize that in a strategic way, if you approach it in a strategic way, you could be able to cover or touch on more than one competency at a time. So you could be smart or clever in your way that you will be talking about one competency, but also letting the APC assessors understand, and I'm talking about the interview part here. So you'll be answering one competency, but at the same time, you could be letting the assessors or the interviewers know that you also know other competencies. So you can cover more than one competency at the same time by working smart. And I will demonstrate that to you throughout our presentation. Another point that I wanted to say, that again, before you start writing down what you guys know, try and do what I call forensic approach in dissecting each competency to find out what is really required. So what is the focus of that competency, and then start approaching it. Even though the competencies that we are going to be covering tonight are to level 1, but also I will demonstrate to you how could that be done in terms of looking into what the competency requirements are and targeting those that need to be covered. Then comes a pitfall that I see with many of the candidates, and that is them trying hard to cover every single example or line given in the competency guide, for them to say that, look, we know what we're doing, we have done this and this and this and this and this, and they try to cover as many of those. The idea of having those different examples, I should say, in the competency guide is basically to give you idea or hints to what you need to cover, and you do not need to cover it all. So you need to look at those and say, okay, I have done this, I have experience in this, I know this, and I have advised on that, and altogether will show that I am skilled enough and competent enough to cover what is required by the RICS for the APC interview. So do not try and cover everything, so you open yourselves up more to questioning. So only cover the items listed on the pathway guide that you are confident and comfortable and competent in. Okay? I also need to ask you to please prepare as many examples as you can in your heads, even for the levels that do not require examples, such as the knowledge. The reason I say that is, one, because that you might forget some of those, or you might be asked a question. If you prepared one or two examples, for example, you might be asked a question that you haven't prepared an example for. So try to prepare as many examples. That's for level 2 and level 3. What about level 1 that does not require examples? For that, what I would say, the example comes very handy in the heat of the session where nerves are running high, you're tense, and you might forget your words and get your tongue twisted. So the example might help you to explain what is required, even though an example is not needed. Or you can think of the example, and from the example, you try to explain what is required without saying what the example is, because the competency level does not require an example to be given. One more point that I also wanted to mention is, and this applies to throughout your interview, that you need to be short and sharp. This applies to all the interview, but it also applies most to the mandatory competencies, because even if those are asked at the beginning or at the end, which most likely is going to happen at the end of your interview process, you're running out of time, you are tired, maybe you have had enough. The assessors need to get everything out of you so they can assess you, because they cannot assess you or they cannot refer you for something they haven't questioned you in. So you might find it stressful. What I would say, especially for the mandatory competencies, prepare yourself with very short, snappy answers, quick and short. We could also talk about that part of our presentation. I think I've said enough about how to approach the APC process in a strategic way and being smart, rather working very hard and diving direct into the technical competencies that are to level 3 and forgetting about the level 1s and the mandatory competencies. Because remember, you could be referred for showing incompetence in any of the competencies at whichever level it is. So do not set yourselves up for failure just because you concentrated on some and you forgot about some. They're all important and they are all required for you to hopefully become chartered surveyors. Let's start with our topics of the day. The first topic we're going to talk about is diversity, inclusion, and team working. And I wanted to say before we move into the topics, I hope you find the tips I've given you helpful. Diversity, inclusion, and team working. And if you notice, I have bolded team working. This is a mandatory competency to level 1. What does that mean? It means that all what is required is knowledge. Okay, so that doesn't mean much. Let's look further into it. What does knowledge mean in the pathway guide? It says that we need to demonstrate knowledge and understanding of the principles, behaviors, and dynamics of successfully working in a team. Again, it could still be not very clear to some. Let's leave it there and understand what diversity means, what inclusion means, and what teamwork means, and hopefully we'll be able to understand what is required for the competency to be covered. So if I start by asking you a question, what do you think diversity is? Maybe from your experience or from some training that you have had. Does it mean anything to you? Diversity, if we look at it through the waterline of visibility diagram that you see in front of you, it talks about differences. There are differences that could be seen that are called visible, and they sit on the tip of the iceberg above the visibility waterline. And those are the things that, as you walk into an office, for example, you could see, such as gender, race, age, maybe. Some people are younger than others. You might see hints towards a certain religion, or you might make assumptions of a person being of a certain religion because how they look. Also, you can make an assessment of the physical ability. A person might be fully physically able, or he might have some challenges. But this is only, as you can see, is the tip of the iceberg. There are diversities that are there, and they do exist, that cannot be seen. And when I say cannot be seen, some of it you need to dig deeper. Rather than spending some time with a work colleague, you need to dig even deeper to find what those diversities are. Things such as values, beliefs, even skills, culture. So looking about being diverse, there are more of invisible or invisible diversities than there are ones that could be physically seen and identified straight away. So let's look at diversity's definition, at least from a theoretical point of view. A quick Google search, for example, comes up with this definition. Diversity is defined as a condition of having many different elements. So it's about differences. It's about many different parts that are not the same. I do like another definition by the Queensborough Community College that says diversity means understanding that each individual is unique, but it also adds another dimension to it, which is and recognizing our individual differences. So it's not enough to see it, you also need to recognize it. So to me, diversity is each and every way in which we are different than each other, the way we are individuals. You might have noticed that diversity has been around for some time. And for those of us who are fortunate enough to go into trainings with their organizations, they all talk about diversity, diversity, diversity. But then after that, inclusion was added to diversity. And for those who have been a bit longer in the construction industry mainly, they could see the change that has happened in terms of the diverse community that we became, especially in including more women in the construction industry, mainly in design or in surveying, or sometimes at site level. Previously, this wasn't seen. So at one point there was only diversity, and then inclusion was introduced alongside diversity, because being different is not enough, but everyone needs to work together and form part of a inclusion for diversity to work. So let's look what inclusion means. Again, from a theoretical point of view, is the action or state of including or being included within a group or a structure. So now I do have two sides. I have a team that is diverse and a team that is diverse, but no one is outside. Because what's the opposite to exclusion, according to Google Dictionary, is exclusion and omission. And those are very strong words. For someone not to be part or to be outside and left outside is very dangerous. Another example says that inclusion is an environment, or another definition says that inclusion is an environment in which everyone feels valued and give of their best. So you can only give your best if you are taken in and included in the bigger circle. To me, if you ask me what inclusion means, it's to foster a workplace culture where diversity is not only there, it is celebrated. Uniqueness is valued, and everyone gets the opportunity to contribute and develop within their careers. So we said that diversity and inclusion work hand in hand, because inclusion gives the feeling of belonging, for a person to be motivated to be able to do a job. So how many people were in a very good paid job, but they decided to leave because they felt excluded? So money could be a motivator and is a motivator if we go to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but it is not the only motivator. There are other factors that might motivate person to stay in a job, to give their best, and to excel in that job if they felt part of that organization or that team. So inclusion means that we need an environment that's free from bullying, that has not only gender balance, all kinds of balances, that's free from discrimination and free from harassment. The title is Diversity, Inclusion, and Teamworking. So we looked at diversity and we looked at inclusion, and within that, trying to explain diversity and inclusion, we couldn't but mention the team. So both diversity and inclusion boils down to having an effective and a functional team. So what are the attributes of a good team? If we look at the diagram in front of you, you could see that the team works around three spheres, one inside the other. For a simple task that can be divided into two, coordination is enough, and that makes a functional team. So if there is a task, for example, that I can divide into two distinct halves, and I say to X to do it, to do part A, and Y to do part B of it, all they need to do is finish their jobs and put it together, coordinate with each other, and they could finish the task. But for more complicated tasks, coordination is not enough. What is required is cooperation. So for a job to be completed, one person needs to do a task and the other person needs to do a different task, which when they are put together, completes a job in hand. For that, coordination is not enough. Cooperation is what is required to have a functional team. Let's move into a more complex job. So in coordination and cooperation, those jobs are independent of each other. So if I have half a job to complete, I can go to my manager and say, listen, I have completed my job, but my colleague hasn't. And in cooperation, the same can happen. But in terms of the more complex jobs, they need collaboration. And what collaboration means, in its simple terms, relevant to what we're talking about, obviously, is one job is dependent on the other person completing their part. So a team or a person needs to start a task and complete it before the next person can even start with their task. In our industry, for example, the design team needs to finish the design or part of the design, issue the drawings, then pass it on to the quantity surveying team for them to be able to prepare the bills of quantities. So that is collaboration between a department and another department to create a functional project team. So, what are the advantages of teamwork? What you see here are very few advantages of teamwork that I chose because they're relevant to what we are doing. But if we just want to talk about teamwork, we could write pages and lists, and we could have hours and hours of lectures and sessions of how important and what are the advantages of a teamwork and a functional teamwork. There's a saying that goes like, a problem shared is a problem halved. And in our industry, I could say a task shared is a task halved, provided that we have a functional team. So you can achieve more in less time. The fact that you are cooperating, collaborating, you expose yourself more so you could learn more. You might take on part of a task that is done by your colleague next to you, that he has more experience in a discipline that you don't have. You expose yourself more by helping that person. By sharing a task, you learn how to trust, because you need to trust that your colleague does a good job and you concentrate on your own job. So that's on its own is a learning curve. you need to communicate, right? You cannot collaborate with someone without communicating, talking to them, exchanging emails, exchanging information, drawing, quantities. So this improves your social communication skills and professional communication skills. So I should say improves communication skills and not only social communication skills, because it could be your professional communication skills as well. There is no way that tasks are shared and people are coordinating and cooperating and collaborating without having little maybe personality clashes or little bit of, you know, I don't want to use the word disputes, but some misunderstandings. For you to resolve those, you are improving on your dispute resolution skills. So if you go through a rough patch with your colleague and then you come out on the other side that you are still colleagues and the job is done to a satisfactory level, then you have resolved your dispute. And also, it helps you build your negotiation skills, because you need to negotiate. You do that part and I do that, you do that much and I do this much, and then you reach somewhere in between. Don't we all do that? So it helps your negotiation skills as well. Because you're given a distinctive task that you need to complete to the best of your ability, deep down you know that you're responsible to complete that task because the team is counting on you. And you know that you'll be accountable for that task that is done to the level that is required to be done to. So those are just some of the advantages of the teamwork that are also helped by including everyone else in your diverse team to have a functional, diverse team that everyone is inclusive. Now, we have covered diversity, inclusion, and team working from first a theoretical point of view, and then second, by giving some examples, right? Now let's look, as I promised you, we're going to look at this from an APC candidate's point of view. So now I need to look at, I know that, how do I demonstrate it for the APC purposes? For those who are senior professionals, and I guess most of the APC candidates in the Middle East come with years of experience, this could be demonstrated in the candidate talking about the team selection process, that they know that the team needs to be diverse because there's either a law that says it needs to, there's a quota, there's a company guidance or a company process that needs to be followed. So talking about team selection process and how they can build a team that is diverse. They also need to talk about the team dynamics in terms of their skill sets, how they could improve it, how can they get everyone involved in the job. An example could be ensuring that the workload is evenly spread, or making sure that everyone's voice is heard. And I must add that it's not only heard, it's acted on. So if it's a valid point, then we need to act on it as senior professionals that have subordinates. And this is how we show that we have covered that competency to the required level. What about the guys who are on structured training routes? They might not have the opportunity to form a team themselves or to select someone in the team. Then they need to demonstrate that they are good team players, that they respect others, that they listen, they do not interrupt, they communicate, they cooperate, they help. Again, if you notice that I have used short sentences or even words, and these are the things that I want you to take into consideration, not only when preparing for those competencies, but for all mandatory competencies, especially for the ones at level 1. Now, do you guys remember what the 5 ethical standards are? The RICS 5 ethical standards? Yep, act with integrity. More? There's 5. Okay, not to worry. Yes, they're coming. Always provide high standard of service. Let me ask you a question then. What do you think, or which of the ethical standards relate to the topic that we've covered so far? Do you think any of the ethical standards relate to the topic that we have covered so far? Does it relate to act with integrity? Maybe. Acting with integrity is about respect. Always provide a high standard of service. Again, that's part of being a professional, right? Act in a way that promotes trust in the profession. If we are diverse, we include everyone, we listen to everyone, we produce a professional work, then yes, we're building trust in the profession or promoting trust in the profession. But to me, those diversity, inclusion, and teamwork relate to treat others with respect. Those are directly related to treat others with respect and take responsibility. Again, if you remember, when I started giving my tips, I said that you can work smart by covering more than one competency at a time. So you could include in your questioning or on your answer and on your answers, I must say, for the diversity and inclusion, a hint that you know the ethical standards and they are always in your mind and you act according to those ethical standards. I think we've covered enough about the first topic for the night, and we've demonstrated what it requires and how to look at it from an APC candidate's point of view. Let's quickly move on into the inclusive environment, which is our second topic for the night. Again, this is a level 1 knowledge mandatory competency. Again, do not underestimate the fact that these are to level 1. This is what the pathway guide says. Don't worry, you don't need to read it. It's a bit fuzzy, I know. I just wanted to show you the page that it is in. So let's read what it says. It says that for knowledge, the candidate needs to demonstrate an understanding of the principles and processes that deliver accessible and inclusive environment, recognizing the diversity of all of user needs and the requirements to put people of all ages and abilities at the heart of the process. In doing so, have a regard to the legal, economic, sustainable, and social case for making inclusion the norm and not the exception. Remember, I promised you that I will show you an example of how we forensically dissect the requirements. So if we read what is required again by the pathway guide, we find out that those are the main points that we need to concentrate on for us to be able to cover that competency. So inclusive environments talks about the principles and the processes that cater for users' needs, whoever those users are and whatever ability they are at. So what are those principles and processes, and what is meant by principles and processes? Those are basically other act of law, regulations, or guidances that we need to be aware of, and we need to let our client know and be aware that they are required for them to complete the job that they need, or to build the structure that they need to build. Again, advising is not required at this level, but we also need to make the client know, aware. For that, we need to be aware. So some of the regulations that I am aware of, obviously there are more that you guys know more about in your industry and in your area, is Disability Discrimination Act 1995, which has now been consolidated in the Equality Act 2010, that's in the UK. So there is an act of law that we should not discriminate against users. And that is broad in terms of what discrimination is and what equality is. So we need to be aware of that exists, and that's an act of law. There's also the Equal Opportunities Act, in terms of providing equal opportunities to everyone. More relevant to the construction industry, in the UK, there's also planning legislations that we need to be aware of to cover the APC requirements, but being professionals that advise clients, we also need to let the client know about. There are building regulations, Part M, and that gives more details about accessible designs for buildings. In Qatar, for example, we have the Qatar construction specifications that spells out what is required and what do we need to know about the specifications required by law in Qatar. In Dubai or in the UAE, there's the Dubai Building Regulations. In Article 26, it specifically talks in details about what is required for commercial buildings. In Oman, for example, as I said, in Dubai, this is relevant to Dubai. So there might be one relevant to Abu Dhabi, or you know, this is what you guys need to research as you guys work in that part of the world. In Muscat, for example, it belongs to the municipalities. So the Muscat municipality has their own regulations for building permits, issued originally in 1992, and there is one for different types of buildings, whether those are commercial buildings, whether are residential buildings, hotels, and you name it. So these are the regulations, the processes that were mentioned before on the previous slide that we need to be aware of, that tells us specifically what the user's needs are. So how do we meet the user's needs and meet what the regulation says? Let's give examples. It could be specific about having access ramps, for example, for the less abled people, physically less abled people. It might require hearing aids in banks, for example, for the customers who are hard of hearing. What about disabled toilets, for example, if you have a restaurant? There are requirements for disabled car parking spaces. Sometimes it tells you how many per 100 footfall, where they should be located, how wide. Again, in terms of accessibility, it talks about door width. So we need to know about those. Corridor width. Not only to ingress to the building, but even egress. We need to know what are the regulations that cover the escape routes. It could be wet rooms requirements. I could relate to this. I used to work on refurbishment projects in houses for people who lived so long in their houses, they became elderly or less able for some reasons that they cannot even use their own bathrooms. So maybe the requirement is for a wet room because this is what the client is requiring to build. So there might be a requirement for wet rooms. We need to be aware of that. What about adapted kitchens? In office spaces, that could be adaptable office desks. So these are the regulations or examples of what the regulations might give us in details that we need to be aware of for us to be able to create an inclusive environment that caters to the users of whatever structure that we are building. Now, again, if you notice, I want to link it to ethics. We might be working in parts of the world that are not that advanced in terms of their regulations. So as an aspiring chartered quantity surveyors, how do you approach that? Ethics comes first. So you need to act in accordance to the ethical standards. And you need to let your client know that these are ethical requirements, even though there is not a guidance or an act of law that enforces that. Enough said about the two topics. I hope I covered it in enough depth for you guys to benefit. Now let's come to the most anticipated part, I guess, especially for the guys who are going for their APC interviews this spring. And I wanted to mention one thing. When I was doing my APC, I was looking for questions like anything. I was asking everyone and everywhere and searching and trying to, to find out, what are the questions? Is there a bank of questions that I can start from? And now I know. The answer is no, because it's what you put on your submission is what you will be asked. And again, I'm going back to stressing the point that I started with, Don't try and cover everything or every example to say that I've done this and that and the other. Just concentrate on what you have done, and you are skilled enough to the level that is required. Put that on your submission, on your portfolio. You will be questioned about it. So you are the one who gives cues to what you should be questioned on. Some of the questions that might come: list the number of behaviors that make you an effective team member. Again, don't go into details and stories and examples. Snap, sharp, bang, bang, bang. Help others. Be positive. Talk to others. Include everyone. Listen. Do not interrupt. Short. Yeah. To which RICS ethical standard or standards does this competency relate to? Again, I would consider that as a smart question, because by answering that, you're covering more than one competency. So it comes both ways. It can come from the candidate, and it also can come from the assessor. List some regulatory requirements for an inclusive environment in your sector. Quick. What are those? Qatar building specification, planning permission, building regulations. Short. Equal Opportunities Act, Disability Discrimination Act. Quick, short, and straight to the point. Are there any regulatory requirements for your sector? Again, the answer is not yes. The answer is yes, and those are 1, 2, 3, 4, if there are any. If there's none, in the country that you're in, you might as well research a country that is close by, that is more advanced than the country that you're in. List some of the inclusive environment requirements in your country is another question that might be asked. Who do you include in your end of year dinner invitation email? So you would say everyone. Yes, that answers it. But why? Because they need to be part of the team. We cannot leave anyone out, because we believe in diversity and we believe in inclusion. Mention some ways that we are different. This is a basic question that knows that you know what that shows that you know and understand what diversity means. So it could be the ones above the visibility line, and it could be some below the visibility line. And I would say, to answer that, I would give some of the ones above the visibility line and some from below the visibility line for the assessors to say, yes, that person knows exactly what is meant by diversity. How do you select team members? Again, the answer for that, for the senior members, is by giving short answers, but they're direct to the point. That I take into consideration ethnicity, a quota, if there is a quota for a certain ethnicity or a certain gender or a certain disability. You would say, I do blind selection, for example. So I cover the names and I go into the skills, regardless of what the name is. We don't ask for personal details. I don't want to know the age of a person, as long as he's skilled or she's skilled enough to do the job. those are the ways that you demonstrate that you know how to select a team member that is diverse and gives equal opportunities to everyone and build a dynamic, diverse team. How do you ensure that your work colleagues are included? By inviting them in, by walking in to them and talking to them, by not having meetings and not inviting them to the meetings, by trying to arrange a group dinner or a group lunch or walk together or go offer help. Those are the questions that I could come up with. Obviously, there are much more questions, but those just gives you an idea of what could be asked part of the APC to cover those competencies to knowledge level. So throughout our presentation, we have covered diversity, inclusion, and team working. We also covered the inclusive environment, and we have spoken, or we have mentioned, some of the possible interview questions. Thank you guys for attending. Thank you for your participation. And I think it's time to start taking some questions. If you could start typing away what questions that you might have. We might give 10 minutes or so for questioning, if there are any questions. I guess no one is asking any questions, or it takes time for it to show on my screen. So I might just give it a minute or two. So while that's happening, I just wanted to close this session by, again, thanking the Middle East Quantity Surveying Association for arranging this helpful CPD session. Yep, a question. Could you please explain team dynamics? Team dynamics are the different ways that you can arrange your team for you to be able to get the best of them. So you might arrange a team with, one very experienced person and a couple of less experienced people with them, with that experienced person, so they can learn from him or her. For the people who have medium experience, for example, you might put more than 3 or 4 with one more experienced person. But for the people who are starting their, just started their careers, you might need to have direct supervision in terms of skills. And the team dynamics goes into, for example, the culture, the ethnicity. But it's about team organization. I hope I have answered your question. Any more questions? How to create inclusive environment at your workplace? What are all key points to be focused? How to create an inclusive environment? You need to let everyone feel part of that team and physically be part of that team. So how do you create it? You create it by not excluding anyone, but making sure that everyone not only there physically, but they are mentally with you. So you respect their culture, you respect their gender and gender needs. You might celebrate part of their culture. If, for example, have dietary requirements, you make sure that they get their dietary requirements, if your responsibility is to do so, obviously. When they are in a team, you ask, when you are in a meeting, you ask them for their opinion, and you listen to their opinion and act on it. And if it is not, if the point that they have made is not valid for whatever reason from your point of view, and you do not want to take it into consideration, try and explain to them that, yes, it is a valid point, you have raised it, but we cannot take it into consideration now for such and such reasons. So make sure that everyone participates, everyone belongs to that team, and they feel that their voice is heard. It could be by creating groups, forums within the team if it's a bigger team, or you're part of a bigger department, that they have their own forums away from management, that they come forward with suggestions that you take into consideration. Those are the things that makes an inclusive environment. Team dynamics, we covered that. Yes, what is unconscious bias? Yes. You know, most of the time we act unconsciously. And this is something that we need to train ourselves not to do. So you might walk into a room that you find someone that maybe look different, right? And then without you knowing, you might react in a way. So that in itself makes that person feel uncomfortable. So that unconscious bias means that you without even recognizing yourself, you might treat someone different to the other. And that's the reason why we're doing these sessions, for us to know what diversity and inclusion means and what is your role as a team member or as a team supervisor or a manager in terms of putting all together and working with the team dynamics. It's a very nice question. I do like that question. Thank you, Vinod, for that question. What can be done to close the gender gap in the industry? Well, to me, gender gap should not exist because we are equally as able. All of us are equally as able, especially in our industry, or the part of the industry that we operate in as mainly quantity surveyors or project managers or building surveyors. So all it takes is that will of not treating a gender as a superior gender than the other. I think there are no more questions coming. So on this note, I shall say thank you again for taking part, and I hope that you guys have benefited from today's CPD session. If you could see on the screen, I've put on an email address that you can get through to me. I'm happy to help not only with those topics, but even with other topics if someone needs help. But again, do not expect a very quick response from me. I promise you that I will get back to you and I'll help as much as I can, but give me some time. Thank you very much and have a good night.